Hi everyone. I hope you're all having a great week. So I've decided to come on camera this week and start my video off in a little bit of a different way. And in some ways I feel like maybe what I'm about to bring up is long overdue. And then in other ways I feel like it's coming at just the right time. I basically want to talk to you about intuition. I talk a lot about creating intuitively and that I'm a very intuitive person and that I use mostly what I call an intuitive creative process. And some of you may be wondering what that means. And for some of you, if you've ever heard anything negative about intuition, it might be a little strange to talk about intuition in the creative process. So I felt like it was an important topic to bring up, and I feel like it might start a conversation within our community that could be beneficial for all of us, for myself and for you. So I've put together a very short 4-slide presentation, mostly to help me as I'm working through talking to you about this. And it's going to be very short, but I hope you'll stick around, and I do hope also that you'll chime in the comments and let me know what you think intuition is and what you think an intuitive creative process can be like. So I won't keep you any longer. I just wanted to sort of introduce this before I jumped into slides, because this is not really my typical way of doing things, but I do feel like it's an interesting conversation to have. It is definitely an important topic of conversation for this channel in particular, because this is what I do for the most part. And I'm hoping that you can learn to trust your own creative intuition more as well. So let's get going. So what is intuition and where does it come from? I mean, is it magical? Is it as mysterious as we make it out to be? And is there any reason to doubt our intuition? First, let's have a look at how intuition is actually defined in dictionaries. According to Oxford Languages Online, intuition is the ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning. And it's a thing that one knows or considers likely from instinctive feeling rather than conscious reasoning. I think it's important to have a look at these definitions. They're interesting, and there's something also important that's mentioned in there. Intuition is not attached to conscious reasoning. And in our society, everything seems to have to be reasoned. We have built a society where the mind, the rational mind in particular, is prized above everything else. But we've forgotten that there's a lot more to our knowing than just what's in our mind. Our bodies are these complex, miraculous gifts that we've been given, and there's a lot more to our ability to decipher things in our lives than just what we can rationalize. As I've mentioned on many occasions, I consider myself a very intuitive person. And if I had $1 for every single time someone balked at the idea of me using my intuition as a way to guide myself, I would probably be a very wealthy person right now, because intuition is just not the thing that people want to trust. We need to see facts. We need to see that there is a reason that the rational mind can make sense of something in order to believe that it's possible. So if intuition is something that derives from an instinctive feeling and something that's not attached to conscious reasoning, is it something valid for us to use, or should we really only be trusting our minds? With all of this in mind, I guess for me, the next thing to consider is, where does intuition come from? Intuition really does feel magical, and it certainly does feel quite a bit mysterious, but it's actually a part of our body's natural way of storing and processing information. In fact, according to Psychology Today, it's a faculty in which hunches are generated by the unconscious mind rapidly sifting through past experiences and cumulative knowledge. What this simply means is that your intuition comes from your past experience. Every single past experience you had is processed so rapidly inside your body that it comes to you very quickly as a hunch or a gut feeling. Maybe some of you are wondering what this all has to do with the intuitive creative process. And I say it has everything to do with our intuitive creative process, because when we were born, we started having experiences, and all of these experiences have helped us shape how we love to approach life, what we enjoy about life, what we find appealing about life, what we notice most about life, and all of those things play into our creative intuition. Here, I'm just quickly sharing some of the things that I find help us develop our creative intuition and how we can use it. So, for one, I think it's important to release attachment to thinking and planning, because when we are thinking and planning, we are very much in our rational mind and we are not giving space to trust our inner knowing. It's also about moving forward without knowing what the final outcome is going to be and trusting in the process. It's trusting that each and every step opens the door to a new possible step. Much like we did when we were kids, it's working with curiosity and a playful attitude. It's not about the final outcome. It's just about expressing ourselves and letting whatever wants to come out, come out. I think exploration and experimentation really help to develop creative intuition, and every single thing we do creatively helps to develop our creative intuition. So, if you have been alive for a certain number of years on this planet, whether or not you've been actively creating since you were a kid, every single thing you have done, that I have done, contributes to what we can include in our creativity. Whether that be watching a beautiful sunset and recognizing that we really love those colors in the sky, or looking at a beautiful landscape and seeing all the different colors and how they interact together, or watching a video and seeing that a certain artist is using some colors that really are appealing to you. All of those little things have contributed to developing your intuition, have contributed to developing my intuition. And even if some of you, like myself, I've been creating now for quite a long time, but there was a moment in time where I was not creating. So as a child, I was constantly drawing and painting, and it was just a huge part of my life. And then at one point, I had to kind of let that go and become more studious and focused on school and my rational mind. But everything kept building, and at one point, I picked it all up. And so what I'm trying to say here is that even if you haven't been creating, or if you haven't created since you were a child, you can still create intuitively today. It's still possible. And like I mentioned in the last slide, one of the very best ways to develop your creative intuition is to experiment and explore. And every week when I'm creating a painting for this channel, that's what I'm doing, because I don't usually start off with a plan. And if I do start off with a plan, it's a very loose plan and it's open for changes. Sometimes it works out, and other times when it doesn't quite work out, in the sense that I'm not absolutely in love with a painting when it's finished, I guarantee you I have learned something along the way. And so I want to move on to the experimenting part, and I'd like to invite you to join me. and see what you'll end up creating. And I guarantee you that with each and every time you pull out your pens, your paints, your paintbrushes, and you create something, you are developing your creative intuition. I would really love to hear if you have any questions or if you have anything that you'd like to add, because some of the information I presented in here was information that is quote unquote fact-based, and then some of it is just me explaining it how I see it, because I have not just intuitive knowledge, but I also have experiential knowledge. And I feel, and I hope anyway, that this can contribute to helping you in your own development as an intuitive painter. So yes, please do contact me in the comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have any questions. And for now, let's move on to the creative process, because that's how we're gonna keep developing this our intuitive knowledge. Thank you for listening. So in this video, I'm going to be working on an intuitive painting. It's actually going to be a little series of intuitive paintings using a grid. It's not going to be a uniform grid where all the shapes are exactly the same size. It's going to be more so a grid where the shapes are different sizes. I'm not actually even being very careful that the angles are all square. I'm really doing this fully intuitively. I'm using some 1/4-inch tape to tape down my little shapes that I want to paint. And I'm going to be working on creating a series of little mini paintings that will all be cohesive with each other in the end. But the goal is to practice um, using just 2 colors and blending those 2 colors, creating marks that are very simple and unique. Well, maybe not unique. I tend to create marks that I love creating, and that's because intuitively these marks speak to me. And I don't know 100% why they speak to me, but they do speak to me. And so I create what feels good for me. The general idea is that this little process is all going to be about experimenting, playing, and just exploring my creative process, because that's how I continue to develop my intuitive creative process. I now have what I consider to be an interesting looking grid of sorts, and I'm going to start working with my colors. Now, when it comes to intuitive painting, I have a tendency to try to work just by looking at my palette, and I pick colors that I really, really like. And in this case, I wanted to work only with 2 colors, so I selected 2 colors that I really love from the M paints that I just bought not too long ago. One is called Cobalt Blue, and the other is Quinacridone Rust. These are 2 colors that when I looked at my palette, I felt very drawn to them, not only because individually they're very beautiful, but I also feel that they look beautiful together. And I think when I mix them together, they're also going to create some other interesting shades of color. As I mentioned before with my intuitive creative process, there generally isn't much of a plan. In this case, the plan was for me to create a grid. I selected 2 colors I wanted to work with, and I knew I was going to be creating some little mini paintings, mini abstract paintings in each of the grids. And I wanted to, of course, because I'm using 2 different colors, I wanted to make them slightly different by using the colors, but I also want to vary the marks. I'm varying the way I'm applying the paint, but I'm trying to keep it very simple. I want you to know, especially if you are a beginner painter or a beginner at using watercolors, that it doesn't need to be complicated in order to be something that could become very beautiful. And so I'm not even going to experiment a whole lot with my paint and how I apply it. I'm going to keep it actually quite simple because I want you to feel at ease knowing that there's nothing complicated here. So when you have finished creating your grid, you can simply start to add the colors in your grid. And that's that. You can play with your colors as much or as little as you want. What's gonna come and become more magical is the little steps we're gonna add along the way. And this for me is something I'm gonna decide each and every step along the way. And yeah, I'm just gonna play it by ear, see how it goes. One thing I recommend when you start out as a new painter is to maybe experiment with the idea of just following along with what someone else is doing. So in this case, if you wanted to follow along and do exactly what I'm doing, I encourage you to do so. Remember when I said earlier in the video that developing one's intuitive or creative intuition is about experimentation and play. It's also about doing. So the very fact of actually trying to do something else that another person is doing can also help with developing creative intuition, because every time you are applying the paint, either by watching what another person is doing, um, or just trying to experiment yourself, you're learning something. So you're learning something that you can carry with you for your next painting project. And so even if you aren't in this moment creating quote unquote intuitively, if you're mostly watching what I'm doing and just repeating what I'm doing, you're still going to be working on developing your creative intuition. For instance, I might have picked two colors that for you were not your favorite colors. Your creative intuition kicked in right there and said, you know what, those colors don't work for me. I would prefer to work with something else. That was your creative intuition speaking to you. So when you get these little nudges, pay attention to them. They're important and they are how you will help to develop your own creative voice. Now I'm going to start working on blending the two primary colors I've chosen for my palette with each other so that I can create other shades of color, because the new colors created are created from the initial colors. Everything is going to go really well together, even though the little paintings, the little mini paintings, are all going to be slightly different. They are still going to be very congruent, and as a grid, when it's all finished, it will look like one painting, if you will. So a whole bunch of little mini paintings to create one painting. So it's kind of like more bang for your buck. Uh, I love creating little grids like this. I find them really fun, and it's a great way to experiment and to discover new types of marks, new ways of blending paints, how to use new paints. Like these colors for me are still very new. I'm still trying to fall in love with them. I love them in my palette. The binding medium in these colors is pretty strong, it seems. But the pigmentation in this paint is really awesome. And so I love, or I should say, I am starting to love working with them, but I'm still learning about them. So creating a little grid painting like this is the perfect way to experiment with some new paints. Orange and blue are complementary colors. What this means is that they are opposite each other on the color wheel, and when you blend them together, as you can see here, they create a neutral color. And in this case, this neutral color is a brown. Now, that's why when we're working, it sometimes can be a bit of a challenge when it comes to mixing colors, because if, for instance, you were working on a painting where you didn't really want to create a brown, you would probably consider this color to be mud. However, when you're working on a painting, it's not necessarily a bad thing to create quote unquote mud. Like in this instance, because again, these colors are the same colors being used elsewhere in the painting, the same colors blended together are creating this beautiful, what I consider beautiful, what I consider to be a beautiful, rich brown. And it goes very well with the other colors in the painting because the other colors in the painting were basically made with these two primary colors as in the main ingredients. So I hope this makes sense. But I hear this a lot that people are either creating mud and really not happy with the idea of creating mud or worry that they're going to create mud when they're mixing paints. So again, this is the type of exercise that you can use to practice blending colors together to see what you're going to get. And for me, when I'm looking at this brown that was colored by blending the cobalt blue and the quinacridone rust, I really love that new color that's created, and it works really well with the other parts of the painting. So keep in mind that the more of one color you have in a blend, the more your color is gonna look like the initial color, I guess. It's gonna look the most. Like for instance, this cobalt blue, I added just a tiny bit of the quinacridone rust, and it created a little bit of sort of turquoisey color that's only slightly different than the original cobalt blue. And if I were to add, for instance, just a tiny bit of the cobalt blue to the quinacridone rust, it would create a variation or a darker variation of the quinacridone rust. So if you have equal parts of color, you're going to probably end up with what I have here as my rich brown in the painting. And then if you have more of one color, the color more closely resembles the initial color, and so on. Hopefully this makes sense. Again, experiment and try things, because that's how you're going to learn about your paints, and that's how you're going to learn how to blend them and what you can do with them. Another way to build up your little mini paintings is to start adding the different colors that you're creating over top what you have created in your background. And for these little mini paintings, I'm going to try to stick mostly with the same types of marks because I want there to be a coherence between all of the mini paintings. I think as a whole, they'll look really, really good together when I'm done. But I want to experiment with creating very simple marks also. It's not just about, creating the same thing all over the place. I suppose I could do that, but I also just want to experiment with keeping things simple. And here I'm like trying something because I generally like to work with circles, and then I was like sort of splattering the paint on there and I wasn't really feeling it. So I decided to change it. And that was like an intuitive hunch. My hunch was initially give that a try. I tried it, didn't like it, and the beauty of painting is that you can change things at almost any point of your process. So if you're not crazy about something you do, you can always paint over it. Never forget that. As I'm working on creating this little series of mini paintings, I'm making sure, I guess, in some way that whatever mark I create in one area, I also create in another area. Um, And this is, again, just to keep things very cohesive. If you wanted to, you could probably experiment with something like this and create something completely different in each and every little mini painting. My intention is that in the end, they will somewhat, you know, create a whole. And so I intentionally am creating the same types of marks in most of the little mini paintings, even though none of the little mini paintings are going to look exactly alike. They are all going to be slightly different, but they're all going to have some similar elements, and that's what's going to make them look cohesive. Again, this is about keeping the process as simple as possible and just going with the flow of your own little intuitive nudges. I like to use very simple marks both with my paints, and I also like to use very simple marks when I'm working with my pens. And so I'll often have vertical lines, I'll often have circles, I'll often have stippling. Those are the types of things that I like to include in my paintings. And so I wanted to show you that you can repeat elements in a painting, and by repeating these elements, you can create a whole painting that looks quite beautiful. And yeah, along the way, you're not doing anything very difficult or very complicated. It's all very simple, but still at the very end, it will look very pleasant. At least it looks very pleasant to my eyes. You'll be the judge at the end to see what you like. And when you look at this painting or this little series of little paintings that I'm creating, you are going to be able to say, you know what, I really like that square. That is contributing to your own creative intuition. It is telling you that that's the kind of mark you love creating. And then there's going to be maybe other little mini paintings in here that you're going to look at and say, I'm not really crazy about that one. I've had that same experience as well. And that's how I figure out what I want to continue working with in the future and what I prefer not to work with again. I don't usually work with zigzaggy lines, but you know what? I felt compelled to give it a try here, and so I am doing it. And this is the perfect place to do it. If I was more committed to a bigger painting and something that I'd been working on for a few hours, I might be less inclined to want to experiment like this. So again, this is the perfect place to experiment and try something new because you have nothing to lose. Except, well, a piece of paper if you want to look at it that way. But really, there's nothing lost. You're going to learn something along the way. I'm really loving the colors and what I've created so far in each of my little mini paintings, but I'm feeling like there's something lacking, and that something is value contrast. So I feel like I need to add a darker color a darker color that will go well with all the colors that are in here so far, in order to add some value contrast. And contrast is something I talk about a lot in most of my videos because it is an important part of my creative process. It's the thing I find that makes my paintings come alive. And so adding these few strokes of this dark blue called blackberry, I think will go very well. Now, because it's not one of the primary colors I used at the beginning of my painting process, I want to try to include it in as many of the little minis as possible. And this is just to create, again, more cohesion um, throughout the painting because I consider this whole entire piece of paper, not just each little mini square, to be a painting. What I'm about to say may sound like a bit of a stretch, but I also say that in the intuitive creative process, it's also very important to be mindful of what's going on in your body as you're creating. So, for instance, if you were creating a painting that was very small and that, very, very simple and that you could easily complete in a relatively quick time format, it might be easier for you to stay in the flow of what you're creating and to stay with that process. But if you're in the process of creating a bigger painting and something that would be a little bit more time intensive, it's important to check in with yourself and to see how you're feeling because the more tired we get as we are creating or as we're doing just about anything, the more difficult it becomes for us to actually be very in tuned with our intuition. And so I say this because if you are in the middle of a very long creative process, it's probably good to maybe set a timer and to take breaks. If you don't feel like setting a timer will work for you, it's still important to check in with yourself each and every part of the process. So if you start to feel, for instance, where you're painting and everything was going well, and all of a sudden you're starting to feel like you're having more creative blocks and you're finding it more difficult to come up with new ideas, you're probably tired. And there's a good chance you need to take a break. You may need to stretch. You may need to get some water. You may need to do whatever else you need in order to get yourself back on track. And sometimes that means stepping away for a longer period of time, and sometimes it can be just about stepping away for a few minutes. I often find that when I step away from my painting process, especially when it's a longer painting process, if I step away and come back with it and come back to it at another time, the ideas start coming to me again much faster than they did before I left the process. And that's probably because I was able to take a break and refresh my eyes, refresh my mind, refresh my intuition, and it becomes easier for me to get those nudges that I was getting before. So don't forget to listen to your body, see how things are going, and offer it what it needs. Because sometimes we're so keen on getting something done that we forget to take care of our most important tool, and that's our body. And our body and our health is really everything. It's what helps keep our intuition alive and well. And so it's important to take care of it as well. When I'm working on my watercolors, I tend to prefer to tape my paper to a surface that I can move around. And one of the reasons I do this is not only so that I can tilt the paper or the painting and move the paint around, it's also so that I can change my perspective on the painting. So sometimes it's good to even just take the painting itself and turn it upside down, or um, turn it sideways, turn it in different ways so that you can have a look at it with a new perspective. And this will sometimes also help to feed you with new ideas, because looking at the painting only ever from one angle can sometimes make it difficult to actually see the new possibilities. And simply turning the painting over 180 can all of a sudden be that little thing that sparks your imagination to start creating something new within your painting. So don't be afraid to also experiment by turning your painting and looking at it from different perspectives. This will feed your intuition as well. I really love to work with iridescent paints. I love how they add a little bit of glimmer and shimmer to a painting. And because I love them so much, it would be very easy for me to go overboard with them. And so that is why I try as much as possible to leave that part of my process to the very end, because if I've already added all the other marks that I felt like I wanted to add, then adding just a little bit more paint in the form of iridescent paint can be exactly the final touch I need for my painting. Now, some people don't like working with iridescent colors, and again, that is your own creative voice. That is something that your own creative intuition is telling you you just don't like. So it's not a part of your process. For me, it's very much a part of my process. I love to work with iridescent colors, and they find their way in almost all of my paintings. I won't say all of my paintings because it really depends on the type of painting I'm creating. But when it comes to watercolors and painting intuitively and being mindful of my creative process, I follow the nudges of my heart and soul. And oftentimes that means there's going to be some shiny paint in there. But you know what? That's my thing, and that's what my creative voice is asking me to do. So follow your own intuition. If iridescent paints don't float your boat, don't bring them into your painting process. It's as simple as that. Listen to what your own creative voice is asking you to do and go with that, because that's going to work better for you than whatever you see someone else creating that doesn't really speak to you. I've had a chance to look at each and every little painting, and I feel very satisfied with what I've created. The whole point of this painting process was for me to experiment and play with marks and paint and color, and I feel like I've achieved that. And when I look at each of these little mini paintings, I really like what I've created. Now I'm removing the tape because I want to see how the paintings are going to look together as a whole. And then I'll really know if my process is completely finished. This simple little process is now finished, and I love all of these little minis. All of them have different qualities that I really like. All of them have taught me how I prefer to create my marks. And when I look at them as a whole, they really speak to me. They seem to fit very well together, and I love that. Whether you've been watching or painting right along with me, I hope this little video and painting process has given you a chance to ponder your own intuitive creative process. And I hope you're feeling inspired to pick up your brushes and get painting again. Thank you again for making the time to join me on my creative journey. I hope you have a wonderful week and happy creating!